Sigrid and Greg. Later that day, Duck, who was thinking how he could cheer Mike up, pulled into Arlesdale with Alice and Mirabelle. He felt sorry for the little engine and wanted to make him happy again. Then, on the platform he saw the very person. One of Miss Kinte's pupils stood on the platform accompanied by an older man. It was Emma Bussell and her father. Emma was a talented ballet dancer and a great friend to the engines on the Little Western. Her father was Bert's driver on the Arlesdale Railway. When she had finished school and ballet class for the day, she would often spend some time with the engines on the small railway, helping to clean and oil them until it was time for her father and uncle to go home. Then they would catch the evening service, usually hauled by Duck or Oliver. Some days this service would be run by Donald or Douglas when the two tank engines were too busy with other work or needed repairs. But whatever the weather, all the engines were glad when she took the time before and after each journey to talk to them as well. Emma told her about Rex. "And so I was wondering, Emma, if you could cheer him up with a dance for him. I know he'd like that." Emma looked at him thoughtfully for a while, then smiled, and said, "Of course, Duck. I know them very solo. Unfortunately, I can't do it for a few days because I have a show to prepare for. I'm playing the lead role in my ballet class's production of Coppelia. I should be able to find some time. In fact, perhaps I could ask my class if we could perform it for them." Duck smiled. "Thank you, Emma. Now all we need to do is to ask the small controller if he wouldn't mind us using the platform for his railway here at this station, and if your ballet teacher will allow you to perform." Emma's father smiled. "Don't worry, Duck. I'm sure they'll agree." As indeed they did. Lots of other passengers climbed out of Alice and Mirabelle and headed towards the small railway. They climbed aboard Bert's train as it pulled in at the station. Most of the railway's visitors had already gone home for the day, but there were some who mainly used the railway to get to and from work, school and the shops. Some of these passengers even brought their dogs along with them. Sigrid never understood why passengers liked taking so much care of dogs. "They just stand there and say woof all the time," she complained as she pulled into the sidings with some loaded ballast trucks. "Why do the passengers make such a fuss over them?" "Because," Bert replied, "dogs are very good companions. They can cheer people up and make good company for them." Sigrid was usually a kind and motherly engine, but she had never quite understood how people could be so attached to animals. "But they don't do anything! What's the point in bothering to care for them if we don't even know what they want?" she exclaimed. "Now stop your complaining! You make it sound as though you'd rather see a dog suffering in the street instead of having a nice, safe place to live," scolded her driver. He had a dog himself and loved it dearly. The line passed an animal hospital. Here, animals were brought if they were too badly injured or too sick for the vet to cure. The engines always remained quiet when they passed by, worried they might scare the animals. Sometimes, the animals would be kept inside if the weather was bad or if they were too ill or too hurt to move. But sometimes, if the animals were recovering well, they would be seen running about excitedly in a special garden not too far from, but not too close to the line. Seeing them like this always made the engine smile, except for Sigrid. Sigrid had never understood animals, and preferred not to have any encounters with them, especially after she had heard about the time Daisy met Champion the Bull. Not even the story of how Donald met Dilly the Duck could change her mind. "They're just daft things, always getting in the way," she grumbled. On the way back, after having picked up some empty coaches from Arlesdale to use for the morning train, Sigrid was forced to stop at Arlesborough Bridge Street by red signal. Blister 2 was taking some loaded wool trucks to Arlesborough to be stored for Rex to take them away tomorrow, and so she had to wait a while for him to clear the line. While she was waiting, she saw, or thought she saw, a small figure moving underneath the road bridge, over which there was a huge traffic jam. "There's something down there!" Sigrid squeaked. "What is it?" "Where?" asked the driver. "Under the bridge," she replied. "What is it?" "I don't know," said the driver, immediately sensing something was wrong, "but I'll go and inspect." He radioed control to inform them of his actions and then carefully climbed down the bank and under the bridge. Then he scrambled back up onto the platform and explained everything to the porter and the station master. He and the porter then went carefully back down the bank, carrying several blankets, while the station master walked towards Sigrid, his face grim. "It was lucky you spotted him. That was a very sick dog you found. It appears the poor thing was abandoned and left for dead." Sigrid gasped. "Whatever could you mean?" she asked. "Take a look for yourself," the station master replied shortly, as the driver and porter returned, carrying a small furry figure, thin as a rake and covered in small lumps. Suddenly, Sigrid understood the severity of the situation. "We've tried contacting an ambulance," the driver explained, "but the roads are too blocked up. We'll have to take Greg here to the animal hospital ourselves. The signal's still at red, so I'll radio control for clearance." He did so, and told Sigrid that since Blister 2 had just passed the animal hospital, they could go along the line to there and no further, while the porter and station master gently loaded the dog into one of the coaches. A vet, who had been waiting in the traffic jam, had seen everything and, hoping to be able to help, volunteered to sit with the dog and accompany them to the hospital. Sigrid was still a little confused even as she set off quickly. "Why call him Greg? Doesn't he have a name already?" she asked. "We don't know. There wasn't a collar on him or anything, and the porter and I agreed he looked like a Greg," the driver explained. They went along the line as smoothly and as quickly as they could until they reached the animal hospital, where several other vets, as well as stretcher-bearers, were waiting for them. Sigrid caught one last glimpse of their dog. "Driver, why is Greg so thin?" she asked. "No one came to look after Greg or gave him any food," the driver replied. Sigrid gasped. She saw Greg slowly turn his head to look at her. He didn't move or bark. He had no strength for either. But the look in his eyes told her he was thanking her gratefully. "And what are those lumps all over him?" she asked again, after hesitating for several seconds, watching as Greg was carried away. "Those, Sigrids, are ticks. They are little insects that suck blood from animals, especially dogs. Some even carry diseases. If a dog gets infected by a tick, it could be very bad." Sigrid shuddered uncomfortably. She was in tears that night. The other engines tried to soothe her, except for Mike, who just looked grumpily in the opposite direction. "Stupid nonsense," he muttered. "Why do you bother caring about others in a situation that you're not affected by?" A loud and angry outburst of voices met this. Over the next few days, Sigrid asked her driver how Greg was, and every time, her driver just looked sadly at her. Sometimes he would tell her what had been done to save him. The vets had removed as many of the ticks as they could. They washed and bathed him, and when they discovered he had a disease called anemia, they gave him a blood transfusion in an attempt to save his life. They even got all the best specialists they knew to see him. But it was all to no avail. A few days later, the driver arrived to start work, accompanied by the small controller, their faces grim. "I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, Sigrid, but Greg died last night, the driver told her, with sadness in his eyes and voice. Sigrid gasped in shock. No! 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 She cried, and she burst into tears. I wish it didn't happen, Sigrid, continued the small controller, tears forming in his eyes too. But remember, you saved him. You are a really useful engine, and I am very proud of you. Thanks to you, he spent the rest of his time in as much comfort as possible. If only he had had that same comfort earlier, then this surely wouldn't have happened. They passed the animal hospital later that day, while taking some wool trucks to the farms. The driver had special permission from control for them to stop there. He applied the brakes, and Sigrid stopped. She then stayed silent for a minute, remembering Greg. Then, when that minute was up, she pulled away slowly and smoothly. She still does this to this day, for Sigrid now understands just how important animals are. She no longer scorns at passengers and their dogs, for she has realized that animals are our companions and friends. It is distressing and unfortunate to know that people are cruel to animals, but it is a sad truth. Animals do not deserve this sort of treatment, but instead people cast this aside and commit acts of brutality on animals or abandon them, leaving them to die. This is something that no one should ever have to experience. And it is therefore important that these animals are protected, as Sigrid and her driver will, I'm sure, readily tell you.